Welcome, Tony, to the Value Podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. We're so grateful you could be here. We know you're a very busy guy, so thank you for coming. Do you want to introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure. My name is Tony Brown. I teach Russian and also Russian culture at BYU. I've been there since 2004. And over the years, my specialties have varied. I started in what's called language policy. And that drew me to Ukraine and Belarus and that area where there are multiple languages spoken. And then I also did some work in what's called second language acquisition. And now I'm doing what I especially love, and that's Russian cultural studies. So
Nice.
Great.
So you probably heard about the craziness going on in Ukraine.
Yep.
Safe to say.
A little familiar with it.
We could catch you up if you wanted.
a little familiar.
So I know you from, I took your class a couple years ago.
Yep.
And I was the one crazy person who didn't serve their mission in Russia or had no Russian experience. I just wanted to learn about Russia.
Not crazy at all. In fact, it's really wonderful, I think, when students who haven't had that perspective come to the class because they lend a fresh perspective on it.
Yeah, it was a great
Really
experience for me because it was a totally different cultural experience than I had had, right? And like you said, I was kind of an outsider into the class, so it was so fun to talk to my different classmates who had the experiences that I hadn't. So yeah, it was really interesting. But you were a great professor,
Well, thank you.
and so we invited you here today.
Thank you.
But you recently returned from a trip to Eastern Europe. I'd love for you to speak just a little bit as to how maybe the climate was there and maybe just some things that you noticed during your travels there.
Sure. So I headed over to Poland on the 6th of March. And the reason that I went there is because I have students doing internships there. From there, I went to Latvia, where I also have students and
Currently doing internships?
Currently
Okay.
doing internships. My travel, of course, coincided with what's happening over there right now in Ukraine. Poland especially is caught up in this because of their border with Ukraine and so many refugees pouring into Poland. When I was there, quite frankly, the only thing that I noticed that was different was that there were people gathered outside the train station, holding flags, singing songs on the street, people trying to raise money and this, that, and the other. I was there soon enough, or shortly after the actual invasion, so it wasn't as obvious as it is now.
Yeah.
The numbers of refugees at the time were approaching 500,000.
Wow.
Now we're over 1.5 million, 2 million in Poland, somewhere around
So
there.
Just in
fast.
Poland alone. Wow.
The total number of refugees is over 3 million now. So this is, as you know, far and away the largest refugee crisis since World War II.
Yeah.
Jeez.
And Poland most definitely has carried the brunt of this.
Yeah.
And to their credit, they have welcomed in these refugees with open arms. And I think part of that stems from their history of remembering what it was like to be occupied
Yeah.
during the Soviet era. And there's a level of compassion that's very tangible there. And as I said, I think it stems from that firsthand experience of what happened during World War II. Ukrainians, those who are fleeing, as you know, are mostly women and children.
Yeah.
Men, for all intents and purposes, are staying and taking up arms to defend. These refugees are moving into all different places, into Hungary, into Romania, now into France, and then up into Latvia, Lithuania,
Wow.
and all the way up into the Netherlands. So
Wow.
it's a mass exodus, you could say. In Latvia, it was less noticeable from the standpoint of seeing, gatherings. The only gatherings that I saw there were in front of the Russian embassy and the Ukrainian embassy, which incidentally are side by side.
Oh, that's got to be fun.
Wow.
Yeah. And so as you're walking down the street there, what you'll find in front of the Russian embassy are people that are protesting in the form of putting out posters and, you know, verbal statements of opposing the war. And then as you continue on the street and come to the Ukrainian embassy, it's night and day difference. It's lined with candles, basically.
Wow.
It's like a vigil, and flowers and people, very sort of somber.
In Latvia,
Yeah.
you said?
So here we have these two embassies side by side, which I think reflects this situation geographically. Also, these are neighbors. These are brother countries, and the tragedy of all of this is that this isn't just competing nations. These are families.
Yeah.
And it's hard to find a Russian family that doesn't have relatives in Ukraine and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so it's not like, you know, where you can walk down this street and have the Russian embassy and the Ukrainian embassy and, you know, like a demarcation between the two. In real life, they're very fluid in terms of actual
Super
family
intertwined.
dynamics. They're very intertwined.
Yeah.
And this is the real tragedy. People feel this on a very personal level there.
Wow.
If you go also a little further into the city, you'll come to this what's called the Monument of Freedom in Riga, Latvia.
Mm-hmm.
And at night, it's lit up in blue and yellow to show solidarity. And thanks, I would say, to the credit of the president in Latvia, he's gone out of his way to say that it's not for us to judge the actions of, or it's not for us to judge the Russian people by the actions of their government.
Yeah.
And I think that's especially important when you have a country like Latvia that has a very large ethnic Russian population, and it's all too easy to judge them as though they were somehow accountable for what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah. It's kind of like the hate crimes that happened in the U.S. because with COVID and people that were from China, people persecuting them. So he's going out of his way to make sure that doesn't happen.
Very much
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
That's really cool.
What would you say your response would be? Because we have seen a lot of that anti-Russian sentiment here in the U.S. as well.
Mhm.
Even just from my own experience, I had in an orchestra right now, and one of my conductors we were playing a Tchaikovsky piece, and he had to cut the piece because he's a Russian composer. And I really had to grapple with that because Tchaikovsky is not the issue. And to demonize, this great cultural piece that is Russia and that is Russian culture and history, I think we lose a lot as an American people, but also we are demonizing the people of Russia and not, Putin or what the actual crisis of the issue is.
Yeah.
What would be your response to that?
Well, that's disheartening to hear.
Yeah.
In no way, shape, or form should the music of Tchaikovsky be sort of conflated with the actions of the current president of the Russian Federation, in my opinion. It's human nature, I think, to want to be able to point the finger, to have an object, so to say, of that projection of anger. It's much more difficult to withdraw that projection and to see that shadow figure instead of being out there in here and being willing to recognize that we all have those dark sides in us instead of so easily jumping to that natural tendency to want to find the enemy without. This certainly wouldn't be the first time that something like this has happened. Go back to the days of World War II, before the Soviet Union was our ally, right? And a colleague of mine recalls growing up in Cincinnati during World War II, And the Cincinnati Opera was performing one of the great Russian operas by Modest Mussorgsky called Boriska Danov. And people were protesting out in front of the opera house, again, for the same reason. So this is not a new phenomenon. It's something that I think we have to grapple with each time something like this happens.
I love that. Just pointing out we didn't just kind of start putting the blame now in the 21st century. It's happened in the past. It's not a new thing that's come out with smartphones. Age of information.
During the Soviet Union, the same thing. I mean, there was the natural tendency to demonize the Russian people. But the Russian people and the Soviet government were two entirely different things. And so it is even today, even though there's not the Soviet Union. Still, there's the Russian people, and then
the Russian government.
There's the Russian government.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize that they are not one and the same.
You talked a lot about the refugees. Do you see that continuing just to get worse and worse? Like what? Do you have any projections
for that?
Here we are
already at 3 million plus. And unfortunately, I think the fighting is going to rage on for probably quite a while to come.
Think like years, 6 months?
No, I hope not. I certainly hope not. But thus far, we've seen cities like Kharkov, Mariupol come under heavy attack. And now Kiev is very much on the radar. Kiev being the capital with the largest population of any Ukrainian city stands to suffer probably the most also because of its symbolic quality of being the capital. And to capture Kiev is, for Putin, really the prize. And it's not going to fall without a serious fight. And Ukrainians, as Zelensky said, even as recently as today, they will fight to the death to save their city. So what that means is what we've seen thus far in terms of out-migration is only the beginning of what I foresee as being an even larger exodus, especially as residents from Kiev begin to flee.
Wow. Maybe backing up a little bit, talking about how this conflict started in the first place, could you give maybe a brief cultural or historical overview as to how Russia came to this place? That's a broad question, but maybe why Ukraine is so critical for them, or why the government made this decision to invade Ukraine.
So I think it's important to look at the history of Ukraine within the context of the broader development of what we now call Russia. The first major, what you could call a government, so to say, major government, really has its home in Kiev. This is 10th century. And the Grand Duke, or the Grand Prince, rather, of Kiev, Vladimir, was really instrumental in uniting all of the different principalities. And one of the ways that he did that was by bringing a form of religion that wasn't practiced in any of the other parts of that region of the other principalities, but it created a unifying force, and that, of course, being Christianity. He was baptized in a city that is today known as Kherson, and that very act, and then subsequently requiring others to be baptized also in the Dnieper River there, flows through Kiev, was really the beginning of this new powerful religion that united the people of what was called the Rus. Over time, the seat of power shifted, largely due to an invasion from the Mongols, and it went to Vladimir and eventually to Moscow. There was a consolidation of power, not only politically, but of ecclesiastical power in Moscow, such that the Patriarchate and the Tsar were very close in terms of their power. Rome was, of course, the center of the Christian church, but Rome fell, and Constantinople became the next center of the church. Constantinople fell too, though, to the Turks in 1453. And so the Russians, looking on, saw what was happening, and they had inherited Christianity from Constantinople, which had inherited Christianity from Rome. So you can see this chain: Rome, Constantinople, and meanwhile, the Church of Moscow is saying, "You see what happens when you go astray? You're taken over by other powers." First Rome fell, second Rome fell. That means there's a third Rome, and that is Moscow. And the saying went, "And a fourth Rome there will not be." In other words, we are the bearers of the true faith, and this is the last. This is where it will stay until Christ's return. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind when you look at what's happening in Ukraine, because for Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, someone who also considers the collapse of the Soviet Union to be the single worst disaster of the 20th century, he looks at those borders of Ukraine and Belarus as being very artificial. And instead, what he looks at is Russia from a broader perspective of this spiritual space, or what he uses the term, the Russian world. And that Russian world extends to where all Slavs are that embrace Russian Orthodoxy. And the saying is, to be Russian is to be Orthodox. So they're really inseparable in that sense. And so when he looks at Ukraine, he doesn't see it as this separate state, so to say. He sees it as historically part of.
It is Russia.
It is. We are all one people.
So the map in his mind is completely different than
The
what
map
we
in his
see.
mind is very different. And these what we call these, boundaries demarcating states, or for him are merely, political. You could say they're man-made. So to bring Ukraine back into the fold has more than just political ramifications. For him, it's about righting a wrong. In other words, restoring what should have been there all along. And so, when you go to Kiev, you'll see a statue of Vladimir looking out over the river where people were baptized. Ukrainians look to him as really the founder of that Russian Orthodoxy and really being central to their history. But now if you go to Russia, as of just a few years ago, you'll find a similar statue in Moscow near the Kremlin. And that was Putin putting that there, and his way of saying, Vladimir is ours. He's not Ukrainian per se. He is all all of the Russian peoples.
Interesting.
And so for him, the designation of Ukrainian and Belarusian is merely just
It's a formality.
It is.
Weird
It's somewhat of
title.
a formality. But it doesn't carry weight for him.
Interesting.
So is he waging a political battle? Is he waging a ideological battle? It's kind of hard to separate the two because they're so interwoven for him.
Do you think that that could be it though? I mean, I don't want to put myself in his shoes, but he's completely destroying the economy in Russia and the people in their lives. Is that all that's behind it?
Well, when you say that, is that all that's behind it? What do you mean?
Is there something else that you think we're missing?
Well, there's no doubt that he is wreaking havoc on the economy there.
Yeah.
Russians are unable to use their credit cards at most banks because they're frozen.
Taken off the SWIFT system.
Yeah, taken off the SWIFT system.
They can't get cash, right?
Yeah.
No, nothing.
Transnational companies are pulling out left and right. Sanctions on multiple banks. It's becoming difficult to buy even your standard food products in some places, just because there isn't that steady stream of imports, exports like there was. This also isn't a new phenomenon. I mean, when you consider what happened after the revolution.
It's not the first time Russian leaders have decimated their people.
Yeah, after the revolution, this was also very much what we saw too, where they isolated themselves from the rest of the world. And basically went at it alone. And Putin is saying, our people will rise to the occasion. Our economy will benefit from this in the long run. I suppose time will tell. It's very difficult in the 20th century, I think, to cut yourself off from the world economy.
Yeah.
It's a different world than it was in 1917.
Totally.
And Russians are feeling the squeeze, and they will continue to feel the squeeze as we heighten our sanctions. Many wonder if ultimately this will, if there will be a breaking point. During the Soviet Union, Reagan's arms race was less so about, increasing the number of ICBMs, so to say, and more so about bankrupting the Soviet Union. And so today people look at what's happening over there and see a parallel in this. Perhaps by increasing the sanctions and putting the pressure on Putin, the people themselves will rise up and call for regime change.
Do you think that's even possible, though, with the way that the Russian government is just kind of has a chokehold on its country? Do you think that a revolution would even be possible?
It's so hard to say. Very few would have predicted the way that 1991 would have
that's
played
true.
out. I was a freshman at BYU studying Russian, and I remember all too well Christmas Day when Gorbachev announced the collapse, basically the end of the Soviet Union. Very few would have anticipated that. The August coup in 1991, of course, surprised everyone too. And there's speculation that maybe there will be something to that, to that effect now, but that's only speculation. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
When you look at Putin meeting with his closest advisors and they're sitting 20 feet apart, it's not because of COVID.
Yeah.
It's because he can't trust anyone, even in his closest circle.
Oh.
That's why he has a food taster, and that's why he's very skeptical of anyone.
So all that stuff's true. Like he actually has a food taster, and
Yeah.
that's the reason for the separation. Because you see stuff like that on social media, and you're like, oh, that's just like clickbait. I guess it's true. Wow. That's so crazy.
It is crazy. So you've talked a little bit about maybe how Putin or other Russian leaders view Russia in the broad term. Would you say that Ukrainians view themselves as part of Russia as well, or do they, like Russia in the broader term,
Right.
or do they view things differently?
There is a definite Ukrainian history.
Yes.
And historically, Russia has tried to whitewash that in the way that they've also tried to whitewash the reality of a Ukrainian language. I mean, this is very important if you're trying to deny a people's identity, deny their language, right? Deny their history.
Wow.
And this isn't, like I said, a new phenomenon either. This, if you go back to 1700s, this was happening in Tsarist Russia, and then continued throughout the centuries. Ukrainians, as I said before, and Russians are so intertwined. It's hard not to be able to see oneself as both. So many children grow up in homes where the mother is either Russian or Ukrainian, and the father likewise is either Russian or Ukrainian, where you'll have a mixed marriage of Ukrainian and Russian. That's very typical, actually, in many places. And so, what does it mean to be Ukrainian when you grow up in a home like that? Well, you can't help but also identify with Russia just because of your lineage in that sense, and vice versa if you grow up in Russia with a Ukrainian parent.
Your family, just like you said earlier.
It's hard to whitewash it.
Yeah, and so on the one hand, there's this sense of we are a family of Eastern Slavs. And yet at the same time, I think Ukrainians, rightly so, pride themselves in their history, and they should be able to. Unlike their neighbor Belarus, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they really made a point of strengthening their national identity through their language and through their history. Belarus struggled in that way. And so there's not that sense of really a distinct identity from Russia like you'll find in a very pronounced manner in Ukraine. And I can only say that because I did my PhD work in Belarus and I served a mission there. I was called to Kiev, Ukraine, but I should mention that I lived in Ukraine even before my mission. And so this place is near and dear to my heart.
Dang.
Lived in Kiev, and
how'd you wind up living there before your mission?
Well, as I said, I was a freshman at BYU and the Soviet Union collapsed, and I thought, I've got to figure out a way to get over there as soon as I can. And so after the winter semester, I arranged to get over to Kiev and lived with the family there. This was, this is right in the aftermath of the collapse, and so the economy's in a terrible state. But there was a euphoria in the air. People were so excited about the prospect of a free country, of being able to start anew, and to be able to have their own identity. And so there was this real hope, you could say, in the air of a new life for Ukraine. After that summer, I came back to BYU, lived in the Russian house, and got a mission call to go right back.
Oh, cool. That must have been a happy
So
day.
I knew the mission president, I knew the missionaries, because
That's
I
so
worked
cool.
closely with them.
Yeah.
And my mission president, I think to his credit, thought, this guy knows too many people here. So
Send him to Belarus.
I didn't even spend a single full day in Kiev when I was on my mission.
Wow.
The day I got there, he put me on a train up to
He's
Kharkiv.
like, nope.
Yeah, he sent me up to Kharkiv, and I was there only for a month, and then he came up and he said, you're going up to Belarus.
Was that the same mission? At the time?
At the time it was. And he was actually kind of clever because he knew, none of us did, that in about a month the mission